Imagine stepping onto a plane, confident and accomplished, only to be met with a dismissive glance and a prejudiced assumption. This isn't just a story of bias. It's a tale of resilience, power, and the moment that changed everything. It all started like any other flight. The airport was buzzing, energy pulsing through its halls like electricity. People rushed through TSA lines with half-zipped bags and blinking boarding passes, hurrying to make their flight, grab a last-minute coffee, or drop into overpriced duty-free stores. Boarding announcements echoed through the terminals, flight numbers and gate changes floating lazily above the murmurs of thousands of travelers. It was the kind of chaos you expect at an international hub, where every hour the whole world seemed to travel past you. But on this one particular day, at this one particular gate, something happened, something that would go viral just hours later and change the course of several lives. Among the crowd was a woman who moved through it all like she wasn't in a hurry, because she didn't need to be. She strode calmly and confidently, her steps precise, her posture straight. A black woman in a tailored navy blue pantsuit, her hair pinned back in an elegant low bun, heels that clicked crisply against the airport tile, and a designer carry-on that rolled with ease. This was not a woman you ignored. She radiated composure, strength, and the quiet kind of power that comes from someone who had nothing to prove, but could prove everything if she chose to. Her name? Danielle Mitchell. And what no one knew at that moment was that she was one of the most powerful women in global technology, the CEO of a Fortune 500 tech company, and a name known in investor circles across 3 continents. Danielle had just wrapped up a business trip in London after finalizing a massive international deal, the type that would change the way AI operates in consumer aviation. She had spent 4 straight 18-hour days in boardrooms, negotiating every last term of a contract worth hundreds of millions between her company and a global airline alliance. Now she was finally heading back home to New York. Her assistant had secured her seat on one of the company's partner airlines, of course in first class. Seat 2A, right by the window. Extra legroom. Privacy. Comfort. She had more than earned it. With her phone in one hand and her passport and boarding pass in the other, Danielle approached the boarding gate with her usual grace, checked in smoothly, and made her way into the aircraft before most passengers had even begun lining up. She smiled politely at the uniformed flight attendants who greeted her, nodded to the crew preparing the cabin, and turned left into the first-class section. The plane had that expensive new leather smell, soft lighting, polished surfaces, neatly arranged welcome kits at each seat. But just as Danielle reached her assigned seat, 2A, something unexpected happened. A flight attendant stepped quickly into her path with a tense smile. She was young, maybe late 20s, with tightly pulled back blonde hair, a customer service smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and a clipboard clutched a little tighter than necessary. She looked Danielle up and down and said, "Excuse me, ma'am. This section is reserved for first-class passengers only." Danielle blinked, then smiled calmly. "Yes," she said politely. "I believe this is my seat, 2A. But the flight attendant didn't look at the boarding pass Danielle held out. She didn't check the manifest or ask a follow-up question. Instead, her already tight smile sharpened, and she pointed behind Danielle toward the back of the plane. "I think you're mistaken. Coach is that way," she said, nodding firmly. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Danielle didn't respond right away. Not because she didn't know the correct seat. Not because she was unsure. But because it didn't take a genius to understand what had just happened. This wasn't about a seat mix-up. This was about an assumption. This young flight attendant had looked at Danielle, a black woman alone traveling in business attire, and instantly concluded that she couldn't possibly be the one with a coveted seat in first class. Still composed, Danielle extended her boarding pass a second time. Her voice remained level, but there was a new edge of assertiveness in it. "I'm quite sure," she said. "Please take a look." The attendant hesitated, then reluctantly took the pass. Her eyes flicked down, and there it was, printed in bold, undeniable black text. Danielle Mitchell. Seat 2A. First class. A flicker of embarrassment, or maybe panic, passed across the flight attendant's face. For a heartbeat she froze. Then, just as quickly, she recovered with a dismissive shrug, offered a mumbled, "Oh, my mistake," and turned away without another word. No apology. No welcome. Nothing that resembled the kind of treatment the other first-class passengers were receiving just feet away. Danielle quietly stepped into her seat, placed her bag in the overhead compartment and sat down. But the air around her remained heavy. She felt it in the way people glanced sideways at her. Passengers who had witnessed the encounter but pretended not to see it. Some exchanged uncomfortable looks. A middle-aged businessman near her cleared his throat but said nothing. A woman across the aisle looked away quickly, almost guiltily. Danielle had experienced microaggressions before. She had been talked over in boardrooms, mistaken for assistants at conferences where she was the keynote speaker, and monitored too closely in high-end boutiques. But on a flight partnered with her own organization, a company under contract with her tech firm, an airline about to integrate her AI systems into their global operations, this felt different. It wasn't just personal. It was a test, a mirror, a moment that demanded clarity, not quiet. She opened her laptop briefly, checked her emails and then closed it again. Her mind was already processing, not out of spite but out of purpose. This woman had looked at her and made a split-second judgment. She didn't see a CEO. She didn't see the lead architect of an aviation tech revolution. She didn't see someone whose signature was still fresh on a deal that would dictate next year's billion-dollar airline improvements. She saw a black woman. And she assumed coach. But assumptions can crash harder than any plane. And while Danielle wasn't out to humiliate anyone, she knew silence had a cost. And she had long ago made the decision. She would never let bias sit comfortably in first class again. Despite being one of the most respected CEOs in the tech world, featured in multiple Forbes lists, invited to White House innovation panels, and admired by a global network of aspiring entrepreneurs, Danielle Mitchell had just been reduced to nothing more than an assumption, an unconscious bias, a stereotype in a sharp suit, not by her resume, not by her name, not by her track record, but purely by how she looked. Her perfectly tailored suit, the Cartier watch encircling her wrist, even the quiet magnetism she carried with every step, none of it mattered in that moment. To that young flight attendant, Danielle didn't fit the unspoken image of a first-class traveler. Because in her eyes, affluence didn't look like Danielle. Power didn't have her skin tone. Success didn't have her hair texture. Danielle, unfazed on the surface but parsing years' worth of memories in seconds, did what she had learned to do since she entered corporate America nearly 2 decades earlier. She stayed calm, steady, resilient. Without snide remarks or visible offense, she held her boarding pass toward the flight attendant once again. Firm, respectful, factual. The flight attendant took it, perhaps reluctantly, perhaps already aware of what it might say but unwilling to fully process the consequences. One glance, and the truth revealed itself in black and white. Bold letters. First class. Seat 2A. Danielle Mitchell. The young woman's face lost its subtle arrogance. It melted quickly into a pale, almost startled shade as if the realization had cold-shocked her from inside. But instead of adopting any kind of humility, any genuine expression of remorse or apology, she simply muttered under her breath, "Oh, my mistake," and walked away. That was it. No smile. No acknowledgement of her own behavior. Not even the standard corporate friendly, "Welcome aboard, Ms. Mitchell." Just an awkward drift backward into the galley, like she hoped the moment would dissolve on its own. Danielle stood there for a moment, stunned not by what had happened. She'd been through worse, but by how numb she had almost become to it. She had been mistaken for support staff at executive forums where she sat on panels. She'd been overlooked, interrupted, second-guessed in business meetings, until the introductions revealed her title. Suddenly, she wasn't just another black woman in the room. She was their boss, their partner, the VC backing their company. The unnoticed, uncomfortable shift in energy always followed. Danielle gently lifted her bag into the overhead bin, took her seat with composure, and fastened her seatbelt, her whole demeanor untouched on the outside. But inside, the moment gnawed at something very real. Not because it was uncommon, but because it was far too common. The cabin was quiet, except for the soft jazz humming faintly through the first-class speakers. Still, she could sense the shift. The surrounding passengers had caught the exchange, and whether they knew who Danielle really was or not, they knew what they had just witnessed. A man across the aisle pretended to dive deeper into his Wall Street Journal but had gone eerily still. A woman one row back glanced up repeatedly before opening her book and flipping through pages she clearly wasn't reading. And then, almost like a whisper, she heard it. "I'm so sorry," someone said softly behind her. A woman's voice, not quite loud enough to be brave, but considerate enough to try. "That wasn't okay," she added after a brief pause. Danielle didn't turn. She nodded almost imperceptibly, gratitude held quietly in one corner of her mouth. She didn't need pity, but sometimes acknowledgement, even in its smallest form, reminded her she wasn't imagining things. For the next few minutes, Danielle stared out the window. Her reflection in the glass mixed with the blurry view of service trucks and busy runway staff. But her mind was far from the airport. She thought about being a 14-year-old girl on a public bus, watching a white man get up from his seat rather than sit next to her. She thought about the time in college when a professor openly doubted that she had written a paper, simply because he had never seen a student like her write with such maturity. And then she thought about the investment conference she attended 2 years ago when two entrepreneurs pitched their idea to her in turn, assuming he was the CEO. Years of this. Layers and layers. All adding up. She didn't carry bitterness. She'd made peace with her journey, but what she refused to carry anymore was silence. And that's when she realized something the flight attendant clearly had not, that her mistake wasn't just poor customer service. It had revealed something bigger. A systemic blind spot that lurked uncomfortably within many high-end spaces, whether hotels, airports, offices, or five-star resorts, the assumption that success wears only one face. One race. One type. Sitting there quietly, Danielle tapped her fingers on the armrest and reflected on the irony. The very airline whose crew had just judged her appearance was now in final stage talks with her company to deliver a cutting-edge AI platform capable of revolutionizing passenger personalization. Everything from check-in efficiency to loyalty upgrade algorithms to post-flight care. And Danielle? She had deciding power in that deal. Full authority to greenlight, delay, or dismantle entire parts of the rollout if necessary. Including training guidelines for staff. Including conduct assessments. Including hiring referrals. Little did that flight attendant know. She hadn't disrespected just another passenger. She had dismissed the woman whose signature was quite literally written into this airline's future. A woman who could change her entire career trajectory, but more importantly, a woman who wouldn't let another woman like her feel that kind of quiet erasure again without action. Danielle breathed deeply and unclenched her palm. Retaliation wasn't on her mind. Reform was. Growth. Accountability. When the lead flight supervisor, older, more composed, would later approach her on that flight, greet her respectfully by name, and thank her for her company's partnership with the airline, the moment would shift. Cold awareness would flood the cabin, and the subtle downward glance from the original flight attendant, standing stiffly in the galley, would tell the whole story without a word. But in this moment, all Danielle wanted was to reflect, plan, show up yet again with grace. Just as she'd done her entire career. She knew the real victories stemmed from dignity, in choosing to speak through action rather than outrage, in commanding space without needing to announce it, in letting those who doubted her witness what Black excellence and womanhood looked like at 35,000 feet. The words would be written later. In blogs, in articles, in social media posts that began trending overnight. Words like poise, power, CEO, and change would swirl around her name as her story quietly taught others what wisdom from the top seat of a plane actually looked like. But for now, Danielle Mitchell just sat in seat 2A, sipping her water slowly, looking out over the quiet tarmac, calm as a breeze before the tide shifts, ready to take off in more ways than one. The plane hadn't even left the gate when the air inside the first-class cabin shifted entirely. For the past few minutes, Danielle Mitchell had sat quietly in seat 2A, staring out the curved window as service carts rolled past, loading the aircraft with meals and luggage. But the feeling in the cabin was heavy. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was loaded. Her mind played and replayed the exchange with the flight attendant like a scene from a movie she didn't audition for. It was cruelly familiar. She'd been reduced to an assumption again, but this time in a space connected directly to her professional identity. And as the minutes ticked forward, something inside her, carefully locked away for years, began knocking louder. Then came the shift. From the front of the cabin, another flight attendant appeared. Older, more poised. Her uniform was crisp and her demeanor carried a kind of calm authority, the kind that only comes with years of seniority and management-level awareness. The moment she saw Danielle, something flickered in her eyes. Recognition. She approached swiftly but respectfully, a nervous but sincere energy surrounding her like static. "Miss Mitchell," she said, voice slightly lowered in reverence. "I just wanted to personally thank you for everything your company has done for us. We're incredibly proud to be working with your organization. Truly honored." You could practically hear a pin drop. Nearby passengers who had overheard the earlier encounter slowly turned their heads, some with confusion, others with dawning realization. Murmurs swept through the first two rows, and eyes began to dart between Danielle and the flight attendant who had dismissed her only moments earlier. That original flight attendant, standing just outside the galley with a tablet in hand, froze. The rigidness in her posture suggested it had taken her this long to convince herself the awkward moment earlier would quietly disappear. But in an instant, the hope that it had all blown over evaporated. Her eyes widened fractionally and you could see it, the exact second she realized who Danielle Mitchell actually was. That name wasn't just on a boarding pass. It was on the corporate contract signed weeks earlier. Danielle's company had recently licensed proprietary AI technology to the Airline, a system designed to streamline everything from passenger data integration to in-flight staff performance analytics. It was one of the airline's most high-profile tech partnerships in over a decade. The contract was worth millions. What that original flight attendant didn't know, what she never even thought to consider, was that Danielle wasn't just some passenger who had found her way into first class. She was a key stakeholder in the airline's future operations. She had the direct ear of boardroom decision-makers. And more importantly, her company now consulted on in-flight staffing strategy and service protocols, which meant Danielle had more than influence. She had hiring and firing authority over multiple verticals tied to partnership performance. And she wasn't the type to wield that power carelessly. But when it mattered, she did not hesitate. The senior attendant, after offering thanks, smiled and walked away, her words still echoing through the air like a quiet thunderclap. Danielle sat still for a moment, feeling every eye in the cabin glance toward her, and then quickly glance away again. She turned slightly toward the aisle and flagged down the senior crew member once more. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low yet calm. "May I please speak with the cabin supervisor before takeoff?" "Of course, Ms. Mitchell," the senior attendant replied without delay. Right away. The cabin supervisor was already on his way. A tall man with a confident, professional demeanor, clearly trained in crisis de-escalation and customer service at the highest level. But even as he approached, there was something about his face that indicated this wasn't going to be a negotiation. He already knew what this was about. "Good evening, Ms. Mitchell," he said. "What can I assist you with?" Danielle took a breath. She wasn't angry. She wasn't emotional. She was exact. "I'd like to make an official report regarding one of your staff members," she said. She prematurely and inaccurately questioned my presence in the first-class cabin, refused to check my boarding pass until prompted, doing so with clear prejudice, and then failed to offer even the most basic courtesy or apology once corrected. The encounter was dismissive, rooted in assumption, and occurred within a context that makes it more than just inappropriate. It makes it dangerous for your brand. The supervisor nodded completely, not defensively but attentively. "I understand," he said. "I apologize deeply for the experience, Ms. Mitchell. I assure you, this will be documented fully and escalated." Danielle paused and looked at him directly. "With all due respect, documentation isn't enough. What I experienced wasn't just a customer service error. It was a direct violation of your company's inclusion policy. Based on your current partnership with my firm, and the level of oversight I have on service-level agreements, I'm requesting that the crew member be removed from duty today, before this flight departs." For a few seconds the supervisor said nothing, not because he didn't plan to act but because he knew she had the right, and the power, and most importantly the reason. "Yes, ma'am," he responded. "I'll take care of it now." Danielle gave a polite nod and returned to her seat, her voice never once raised during the exchange. The supervisor disappeared behind the curtain to the front galley. The original flight attendant, who could hardly keep from glancing side-eyed through the opening, had likely overheard pieces, if not all, of the conversation. And a minute later the supervisor returned without her. She was no longer present in the cabin. No announcement. No drama. Just quiet consequences. The tension among the passengers was now unmistakably different. Some looked relieved. Some even smiled faintly in Danielle's direction, offering nods of silent support. A man in business casual leaned over discreetly and said, "That was handled with class. Well done." Danielle simply offered a small smile and turned her gaze back to the tarmac, now lit with orange lights reflecting off puddles of water from an earlier drizzle. But inside, she wasn't angry. She wasn't smug. She was resolved. Resolved never to accept less than respect. Resolved to speak up not just for herself, but for every woman who had ever been doubted, dismissed, or overlooked in spaces they had every right to be in. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about consequence. The plane hadn't even taken off yet, but someone's career path had just changed forever. Not out of malice, but by the weight of a moment rooted in truth. Because change is often quiet. It comes not in confrontation but in correction. Not in shouting but in standards. And Danielle Mitchell? She carried both effortlessly. As the jet engines finally revved up and the plane taxied down the runway, Danielle closed her eyes. Finally relaxed, if only slightly. A flight that began in judgment had now become a flight towards something better. Not just for her, but possibly for the airline itself. And somewhere in the paperwork and policy manuals waiting to be rewritten, her name would carry a different kind of power. Not just as a CEO, but as the quiet hand that made accountability take off. The supervisor returned to the aisle with a calm but stern expression. Without raising his voice or signaling panic, he leaned toward the galley door and quietly motioned for the flight attendant involved in the earlier encounter to join him at the front of the cabin. She looked up from the beverage cart she'd been mechanically organizing, clearly caught off guard. In her eyes you could already see it, the uneasy blend of confusion and anticipation. She sensed something was coming, something bigger than a simple correction or a quiet reprimand. And as she straightened her posture and followed the supervisor toward the front, her composure started to splinter. Passengers near the scene glanced up, not obviously but subtly. Curiosity hummed just under the stillness of the cabin. Danielle Mitchell sat in her seat, calm, unshaken and poised, but her eyes followed the movement. It wasn't anger on her face. It wasn't vengeance. It was resolve. The kind that had taken years to polish. A clarity that only came after being dismissed, doubted and disrespected more times than she could count, and always choosing the high road. But this moment? This wasn't about ego. This was about principle. At the front of the cabin, near the entrance where passengers typically boarded and where the captain's door sat sealed, the supervisor gently gestured for Danielle to join them. She rose unhurried, smoothed her suit jacket and walked forward. Her steps echoed in the muted silence of first class. The flight attendant stood, arms folded now, defensive but anxious. She had the look of someone who had already realized she was standing at the edge of a consequence she never expected. Danielle took her position calmly, holding the space with that same authority she brought into every boardroom and panel discussion. She locked eyes with the young woman, not to belittle her, but to make sure her words landed with the weight of sincerity they deserved. "Before this flight takes off," she began, her voice steady but firm, "there's something you need to understand." The flight attendant blinked and opened her mouth slightly as if to speak, but Danielle continued without raising her tone. "You judged me based on what you thought I looked like," she said. "You treated me as though I was lost, as though I didn't belong in this section. Without checking my name, without reading my boarding pass, you decided that people who look like me aren't first-class passengers. You dismissed me. You saw me and only saw a stereotype." Her voice was like a calm tide, steady but powerful. Not seeking to shame but to inform, to press truth into a space where truth often goes ignored. "You see," Danielle went on, taking a small step closer, not in aggression but in presence, "what you didn't realize is that I'm not just another passenger. I'm one of the top executives at the firm your airline just entered into a major contract with. A multi-million-dollar agreement that affects everything from digital systems to personnel structure, including decisions that impact in-flight service." The flight attendant's composure visibly cracked a little more. She swallowed, eyes darting to the supervisor and then back to Danielle, as if hoping for permission to undo this moment. But you could tell it was too late. I stand for something, Danielle said, her voice softening just slightly. I stand for respect. I stand for leadership. I stand for women of color who've worked twice as hard to be seen as equals. And what you showed me today, what you chose to show every passenger who saw that interaction, was the opposite of those values. And that can't be swept under the rug with a quiet excuse. The flight attendant began to stammer, breaking the silence with the awkward chokes of a brewing apology. I didn't mean to offend you, I just thought. She paused, perhaps realizing that "I just thought" was the exact problem. Danielle didn't need the rest. This isn't about personal malice, she said quietly. It's about perception. It's about a choice you made without thinking, and what that says about the way you see people. Especially women like me. This wasn't a mistake. This was a mirror. For you and maybe for this entire airline. The supervisor nodded slowly. He already understood the full picture. In fact, he had likely seen this kind of scenario play out before, but perhaps never with someone like Danielle. Someone who could sit silently or choose instead to hold the system accountable, with grace and absolute clarity. Thank you, Ms. Mitchell, the supervisor said one final time. Then he turned to the flight attendant and in a low tone that made the whole interaction feel even more sincere said, "We're going to ask you to step off this flight effective immediately. You'll be debriefed at base. Please gather your things." The flight attendant hesitated for only a second before lowering her eyes and stepping toward the galley. The shuffle of her shoes against the aircraft floor was the only sound for a few seconds, followed by the soft buzz of passengers whispering in tandem behind their seat dividers. No cheers. No applause. Just realization. Accountability. Danielle returned to her seat. She didn't gloat. She didn't look smug. She didn't so much as glance back toward the front of the plane. As she sat down, adjusted her seatbelt again, and leaned back into the leather of seat 2A, a quiet sense of affirmation washed over her. The choices she'd made in her career, the barriers she pushed through, the uncomfortable conversations she never ducked, they all built to moments like this. Not for revenge, not for headlines, but to remind people that respect must exist from the moment someone walks through the door or boards a plane. She glanced across the aisle. A middle-aged woman gave her a tiny nod, her lips pressed into a line of quiet admiration. Small gestures like that meant something. Not everyone had the power or comfort to speak up, but they watched. And sometimes watching someone else take a stand helped others find their voice later. As the aircraft began to taxi, the mood shifted. Lighter, freer. A new flight attendant took over in the now empty position. She offered Danielle tea, called her by name, and treated her the way all passengers should be treated. Not because Danielle had power, but because she's human. The engines vibrated underfoot as the plane sped down the runway, and finally lifted into the night sky. A minor turbulence started, then steadied, and Danielle opened the tablet on her tray table to review a presentation for tomorrow's executive meeting. But her mind wandered back briefly. She thought of every woman, every person of color who has ever been told, "Are you sure you belong here?" in some form. She thought about how many remained silent, not because they lacked courage but because they feared the fallout. Then she thought about how, just maybe, this one interaction would ripple outward. That flight attendant would likely never forget the name Danielle Mitchell or the lesson that came with it. And the passengers who watched quietly? They wouldn't forget either. The flight continued without issue, quiet and uneventful in the physical sense. But beneath that surface, something had undeniably changed. In that aircraft cabin, for a fleeting but powerful moment, discrimination was recognized, addressed, and refused. And that story, the one that began with assumptions, was far from over. In fact, it had just taken off. Hours after Flight 293 had safely touched down at JFK International Airport, the events that transpired on board were far from over. While most passengers went on with their lives, grabbing bags, hurrying to scheduled meetings, or catching connecting flights, one traveler, seated just a few rows away from Danielle Mitchell, couldn't forget what they had witnessed. They'd seen it all, the judgmental glance, the hesitation when Danielle showed her boarding pass, and the dismissive, "Oh, my mistake," that followed. But more importantly, they saw what happened afterward. A woman who could have chosen outrage, instead choosing resolve. A woman whose quiet strength, undeniable presence, and laser-sharp professionalism didn't just command attention. It changed the outcome of the entire flight. The passenger, a freelance journalist on his way home from a tech conference, opened his laptop in a quiet cafe in Terminal 4. He began typing a post on LinkedIn, but halfway through, he shifted to X, formerly Twitter, realizing his 400-character reflection wouldn't do justice to what he had seen. So he kept typing, letting the experience pour out of him, not as a mere rant but a reflection. It was a 700-word piece, simple in tone but powerful in message, and the title? The Classiest Person in First Class, and the Moment That Humbled All of Us. He detailed the uncomfortable silence, the shocked faces of other travelers, and how no one stood up until Danielle, the woman they all underestimated, took control of the situation. He described how she didn't yell, how she didn't raise her voice, and how she didn't insult anyone. Instead, she spoke with clarity, purpose, and the authority of someone who had worked too hard to shrink under the weight of ignorance. What struck him most wasn't just the way she handled it. It was how she changed the narrative. What began as prejudice ended in poetic justice. And buried within the story, one line would capture the internet like wildfire. Never judge a book by its cover, because that book just closed $1 million deal, and closed the door on ignorance too. The post went viral within hours. It was picked up not just by tech blogs but business journals, motivational speakers, and DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, advocates. Comments poured in from professionals across the globe. CEOs, startup founders, flight attendants, young Black women entering their first management positions, fathers who thought of their daughters, mothers telling their sons to listen and learn. The story had touched a nerve that went deeper than aviation. It exposed the quiet prejudice that still lived in corporate spaces, luxury seats, and high-level partnerships. But even more, it uplifted the importance of power handled with grace. Soon enough, Danielle's name was trending. Not because a PR team pushed it, and not because she'd recorded the event herself, but because she didn't have to. The authenticity of her stance, the integrity of her action, and the elegance with which she protected her boundaries had done the job. Journalists reached out. TV producers requested interviews. Her office received over 100 media inquiries in less than a week. But it wasn't until Danielle herself finally broke the silence online that the story truly came full circle. On her company's official LinkedIn page, followed by tech giants, investors, and thousands of young dreamers, she shared a composed message. Respect shouldn't come with conditions. No matter your race, gender, or title, everyone deserves dignity. Sometimes the best way to teach change is by demanding it. The post gathered millions of impressions. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. She didn't share details. She didn't name the airline. She didn't relive the tension. She simply affirmed what people needed to hear. That dignity should never be a privilege. That respect must be the default, not the reward. People applauded her not just for what she did, but how she did it. Think pieces hit Medium. The Guardian ran a special section on gender and racial bias in luxury travel, and DEI leaders began citing Danielle's response in corporate training materials. HR departments printed out slides titled The Danielle Standard. A notion that overlap between status and humility isn't only possible, it's necessary. What made her reaction even more powerful was that she didn't weaponize her title. She didn't declare who she was until it mattered, until the confrontation demanded truth. And when she had the opportunity to cause a scene, to humiliate, she didn't. She simply corrected. And in doing so, corrected something far more broken than protocol. She challenged behavior that had managed to survive far too long in high places. For many who followed the story, this was no longer about airline seating or a single employee's mistake. This was about what happens when people in power stay quiet, and what shifts when one of them finally holds the line. Danielle Mitchell, without stepping onto a stage, had become a beacon. A reminder. That class isn't defined by a seat number. That power isn't in retaliation, but in restraint. That real leadership doesn't need an audience to make an impact. She didn't make a scene. She made a statement, one loud enough to travel beyond the runway, beyond her business circle, beyond New York boardrooms, and all the way into living rooms, classrooms, and meeting tables around the world. Her story was retold during DEI workshops in Fortune 100 companies, She was anonymously quoted in leadership seminars focused on unconscious bias. Young women of color printed her quote and taped it inside notebooks and cubicles. Respect shouldn't come with conditions. And in airport lounges from London to LA, glances began to carry just a little more accountability. Because now people wondered, could the woman they're overlooking be the boss's boss? Could the man in sneakers be the founder? Could the college-aged girl in comfortable jeans be the next major deal-maker? They should have wondered all along. Because in a world where people are trained to spot power through polished shoes or skin tone or accent, Danielle Mitchell reminded everyone that true influence isn't seen, it's felt. And it only takes one moment, handled with purpose, to expose an entire system's blind spot. So wherever you are, whether you're flying in coach, leading a boardroom, managing a store, handling clients, or just walking down an unfamiliar hallway, remember this. Don't let appearances fool you. Because the very person you're silently judging could be the one signing your next paycheck or canceling your contract. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this powerful story, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more inspiring content.